In this review session, what we're turning to is in many ways a result of everything that we've been talking about thus far. All the increases in productive capacity, all the increases in technology, all of those things are leading us to a point where Europe, Western civilization, has so much productive potential, it is almost like a kettle under heat. It's bubbling full of steam, it needs a release valve, it needs to go someplace, and where it's going to go is Asia and Africa. And so what I want to trace is looking through what happens in this time period. And this time period is often cataloged as an era of new imperialism, as a way of trying to differentiate it from, say, older periods of imperialism, such as the Spanish conquest of the New World and things like that. Broadly speaking, it's believed to have begun around 1830, which is the French conquest of Algeria, and goes straight on through the First World War. But beyond time, beyond saying, oh, it's new because it's newer, there also were two other elements. There were sort of a new powers involved in this and a new purpose. Many of the countries that were involved in imperialism during this time period were new nations that we discussed in Module 8. Germany and Italy were involved in imperialism during this time period, as was Belgium. But it was also driven by a new purpose, which we've talked about before, namely capitalism. Namely the desire of capitalists to occupy, control, and develop the lands across the rest of the world to make them more efficient, more economically productive, and make them serve the interests of the Europeans themselves. Another example of result, if you will, is that so much of what we talked about in terms of the Second Industrial Revolution and technological change really comes to the forefront in this period of imperialism. Each of these technologies that I've listed here, the so-called tools of empire, showcase, if you will, the practical application abroad of the developments that we've been tracing in Europe proper. So you have steamships, armored steamships, which massively increase the power projection of European powers. Armored steamships, steel encased steamships. The administration of an empire is made easier by the developments in communication technology. The telegraph allows you to administer an empire far more easily than you would if you had to rely on sending letters overseas. Quinine, medical technology, medical developments. Quinine is critical to the ability for Europeans to become engaged in Africa. Prior to this period, you're looking at a time in which Europeans are dying in massive percentages of every expedition they send out to Africa. You need a medical advancement, namely quinine, which is a prophylactic against malaria, for Europeans to even be able to contemplate colonizing or imperializing the continent of Africa. And lastly, again, that power projection of Europeans, you get the development of more sophisticated weaponry, such as the Maxim gun, one of the world's earliest machine guns. This is an example of, again, power projection, as well as enabling Europeans to oftentimes defeat far many more indigenous people in the lands they're conquering than those they're having to send. If you have two men firing a Maxim gun, you're able to kill many more people than if you had to rely on each man with a rifle or something like that. So what you should see in that is an outgrowth of the Second Industrial Revolution. Now, how do these new tools and new motives play out in, say, Asia? Well, in some cases, it's a continuation of what we've seen before. The French continued their developments in Asia, building off of the conquest of Napoleon III and eventually acquiring the rest of what would become French Indochina. But by far the most famous example of imperialism in Asia at this time period comes from the British, and the British being in India. The British East India Company is still around, it's still alive and kicking, and what they're looking for is a way to promote their profits. And what they realize is they have this wonderfully addictive drug, opium, that is being produced by poppy plants in India, but they really don't have any place to sell it. Until they strike upon a smart idea. Let's sell it to China. This is an addictive drug. They've already become attracted to tobacco. During the 19th century, a new kick will be coming from mixing tobacco and opium and smoking them together by many in China. And opium becomes a drug that is reaching people from the lowest strata of society to the highest, and carrying with it any number of social and economic problems as well. But for the British East India Company, who cares? They're making tons of profits on the sale of opium. Now, China, unsurprisingly, tries to step in and ban this trade. And in their attempts to ban this trade, they come into conflict with the British Empire, because when they take definitive action, seizing a British ship and confiscating the opium, which is being illegally traded in China by the British East India Company, British liberals at home are upset at this affront to British free trade and free contracts. And so the British government gets involved and sends military forces in what will become known as the Opium Wars. And here you see the first effects of that powerful power projection of the British Empire. The British are able to send troops, destroy what is in China, massively overawe their ships, and functionally begin to chip away at Chinese sovereignty. Indeed, the Opium Wars is sort of kicking off a period in which China was slowly being carved up, losing its losing its sovereignty in terms of being carved up by Europeans for spheres of influence. And so when we examine this period of time, what we have is, if you will, Asia being carved up, not only in terms of empire, but even when we're looking at China, China is losing its sovereignty to European powers who claim spheres of influence. And these spheres of influence pretty much allow them to almost run that area as if the Europeans were in charge. For example, a good practice was, if a European committed a crime in their sphere of influence, Chinese courts couldn't prosecute him, only Europeans could. And so again, even though China on this map is not carved up, it's not made a colony, it's still deeply divided and deeply weakened during this process of imperialism. So let's turn to Africa. In Africa, you see the same developments in terms of imperialism on display, and indeed probably Africa is its most famous. As I said, the era of new imperialism generally is ascribed to 1830 onwards, namely the French conquest of Algeria. But it really kicks off in the latter half and certainly the last 25 years of the 19th century going forward. Now, the reasons for that are varied. Two things in particular which might help explain why imperialism really kicks off in Africa is, in 1869, the Suez Canal is opened, and this Suez Canal not only fundamentally transforms world trading patterns, namely allowing you to cut through the Suez Canal rather than having to send your ship all the way around the tip of Africa, but it also therefore makes Africa more important and more easy to reach. And so what this means is people are enamored with, say, the eastern coast of Africa and penetrating the interior. And you even have an example of a new power, Belgium, trying to lay claim to the massive area of the Congo in King Leopold. And all of this interest in Africa eventually leads to a conference in which, in 1885 in Berlin, European powers hammer out, if you will, the ground rules for colonizing Africa, imperializing it, and taking control of territory. And once those ground rules are in place, really things pick up. To give you a sense of the speed and scale of this, you get what is known as the scramble for Africa. This is a time period in which people are literally scrambling around for territory. This consists of old powers like France and Spain competing with new powers like Germany and Belgium to pick up every bit of Africa they could. By the end of the scramble for Africa, functionally 90% of the continent of Africa was taken over by Europeans, and that underscores just how quickly and fast the Europeans tried to lay claim to the territory in Africa. But more than that, you should see in all of this not not just political conquest, not just economic conquest, but in many ways a intersection with some of the philosophical developments, the scientific developments that we've talked about before came to the forefront. Because in imperialism, the meaning was just as important as what they were doing politically. Namely, what's the meaning of imperialism? Well, social Darwinists looked at all of this and said, well, of course we're conquering the rest of the world. These are lesser people after all. Indeed, any number of social Darwinists at this time period are talking about a hierarchy of races, in which, of course, the white European is far superior to these other races, and indeed, of course, the black African is by far the lowest on the scale of the hierarchy of races. So why are Europeans conquering these people? Well, of course, because they're far superior. You even have thinkers and philosophers like Hegel proposing things like, well, Africa is full of childlike people, so of course it has no history, it has no point, it has no purpose. We can ignore it and pass over it because it is a land shut up and filled with children and the childlike. So again, in all sorts of areas, people are believing that imperialism is not only justified, but in some ways sanctified, because isn't it scientific that the Europeans are taking over these people? The best example of this attitude is probably Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. Giving you a short selection here. Take note of how the people of the world are depicted. Your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, giving you a sense of the attitudes of Europeans towards the people they're conquering. And this poem is famous either as both a reflection of European attitudes or perhaps a biting satire against some of those opinions. It's so sort of on the nose, people can't help but think that Kipling knew what he was doing. But again, a sense of this perception of the peoples of the world as being beneath Europeans, as well as a sense that what they're doing was somehow altruistic. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. That Europeans are doing this for the purpose of the foreign peoples. Again, and what's the purpose of Europeans during this time period? Or at least according to this poem, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Indeed, there's a whole host of opinions during this time period that what the Europeans are doing is really a very kind thing. They're trying to civilize these lesser people. And so again, what you should see in this is the imperialism in Asia and Africa are deeply bound up with some of the cultural developments that we talked about in our last lecture. Although in terms of thinking about all these Europeans and all this messy work in Africa, it's helpful to realize that Kipling's poem was not written about the Europeans. Kipling wrote his poem in honor of, if you will, the American expansion into empire building. The Americans had conquered the Philippines from the Spanish Empire, and Kipling produced this poem in many ways as in honor of the American conquest, and perhaps as a way of saying, you who are just beginning the empire, you who are just beginning this imperial project, let me make clear what it is you're doing and what your burden is. And so what we should see in all of this is all of Western civilization is getting engaged in this project, this expansion abroad. And again, unfortunately, what this means is when these powers come into conflict, this is going to be a conflict that consumes nearly the entire globe.